Well, hello. My name is Sarah Muir, and I just want to be here to welcome you and to thank you all for coming today. I'm on the PIBC board, and I'll start our session with a land acknowledgement. So the Planning Institute of British Columbia recognizes, acknowledges, and appreciates that we are able to live, work, and learn on the traditional territories of the First Nations and Indigenous peoples of BC and Yukon. I want to acknowledge and respect that we're gathered on the traditional and unceded territory of the Syilx Okanagan people, whose traditional and cultural processes and relationships with the land continue to this day. Acknowledging the principles of truth and reconciliation, we recognize and respect the history, languages, and cultures of the First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and all Indigenous peoples of Canada, whose presence continues to enrich our lives, this region across the Okanagan, and our country. So, thank you. As I mentioned, I'm with the board, and I wanted to share with you a little bit of our priorities for this year. This is my third term on the board. We've engaged to do some strategic planning last year. These are my colleagues, all their smiling faces. We came together to identify a vision for PIBC, seeing it as a thriving organization supporting professional planners to manage change in support of resilient, connected, inclusive, and vibrant communities. So we have three strategic priority areas that we're engaged in this term. A first priority is to pursue justice, equity, diversity, decolonization, and inclusion. We're also looking to enhance the value, engagement, and recruitment of the membership. And lastly, we're just looking to advance the profession across the province and across Canada. So looking to build relationships with the province, the Yukon territories, and allied organizations, and basically raise the profile of our profession and organization. So with that, we're here today with part of the Peer Learning Network. And as you may know, the province of BC has partnered with PIBC to develop and implement the new Peer Learning Network. Essentially, we want to support local government staff and colleagues across the province to share knowledge and case studies and information that you have regarding the new housing and development approval legislation, and to offer you the chance to ask questions of each other and share knowledge. I want to say how grateful the board is for the hard work of Executive Director Dave Crosley, and he's been working with esteemed Kristen Agnello, who have started and committed to launching the PLL network. And today we have City Spaces who will be joining us. They've developed today's agenda, and they'll be facilitating and taking notes of today's discussion that we'll share as resources on the PLN Learning website, on the PIBC webpage. So our first PLN webinar was Ask a Lawyer. It was held on February 23rd. So that's been recorded, and again, it's on as a resource on the webpage. We hosted our first in-person session in Prince George at the end of February, and we were just in Victoria on Friday. We're here today in Kelowna, and then we have a session on Thursday, on March 28th, in Vancouver for the folks in the Lower Mainland. So we're also looking to host virtual sessions in the coming month that'll be tailored and focused towards regional districts and rural areas across the province. We're continuing to build out the PLN webpage, adding links and resources and materials gained from the insights of these discussions, as well as information and resources that partners and external organizations are sharing. So if you have questions or if you have resources to share, don't hesitate to email. You can reach us at peerlearning@pibc.bc.ca. And with that, I'll pass it on to Susie then to go through the day's agenda and to introduce you to our speakers for today. Thank you very much.
All right, I'm just going to get Lance to help me with my slides here, but yeah, thank you, Sarah, for that opening. Welcome. Yeah, go to the agenda, and then go over to. Okay, great. Thanks, Lance. Okay, so I'll just start off by, again, welcoming you all. Thank you so much for coming. It's great to see everybody. We're happy to be here. And today we have a full agenda, so I'll just start off by kind of talking about who we are in terms of City Spaces, our role of facilitators, and then I'll walk you through the agenda today. So City Spaces as a firm has been hired by PIBC, and we're both community planning and development consulting. We primarily work with municipal and nonprofit clients to help deliver lasting, livable, and inclusive communities with an emphasis on social sustainability. And as Sarah mentioned, my name is Susie Lunn. I'm a senior community planner at City Spaces, and I'm going to introduce the three facilitators at the back. We have Anya Nokovic from City Spaces, our senior engagement specialist, Jessica Glover, community planner, and Kevin Green, our senior planning analyst. So we'll be getting them involved a little later on when we do our small group breakout sessions. And in terms of some of the logistics, we have coffee and tea and water at the back and on your tables. The bathrooms are just down the hall on your right there. And at our break, we do have some snacks coming, some cookies and things. So that will be arriving shortly. Our role as a facilitator is to create a safe space for dialogue, and the goal of today's event is to create opportunity for peer-to-peer learning in the regional context, and also to network and share learnings from each other. So hopefully through the small group discussions, you can meet some new people, get some new contact information so you can go away from these events and kind of continue to share information. So in terms of our agenda today, we will have 3 presentations from 4 different speakers. First, we'll start with Nola Kilmartin from the city of Kelowna, and I will introduce her in more detail shortly. Then we have the district of Summerland, the town of Oliver. We have Brad Dollevoet and Randy Houle. And then we will also have Alison Espivit from Lidstone. Alison is a municipal lawyer, and we'll speak more on the legal side of things. Then we'll have a full Q&A session, probably just about 10 or 15 minutes. You can ask the panelists specific questions, but they will also be available through the small group sessions, and we'll kind of float around if you have any follow-up questions. Then we'll have our break and our cookies and our snack, and then that's when we'll do the breakout session after that. And through the Menti poll, we've kind of have developed which topic areas that you most are interested in, and so you can go to those tables. And then we'll come back and have a large group discussion, closing remarks, and we'll wrap up around 4 o'clock. All right, so, and I also wanted to mention that we will be video recording to capture the presentations. You all won't be recorded, just the presenters and the slides. So nothing that you say in the breakout sessions will be recorded other than what you write down. During the Q&A, the camera will be fixed on the podium and screen at the front. And so there may be some audio only captured, but no faces. And we will be taking some photos, but we'll try not to get any faces in. And if you really don't want your photo taken, please come and talk to one of the city spacers. So without further ado, I'll now introduce Nola Kilmartin, the Chief Planner from the City of Kelowna. Nola is a registered professional planner and experienced public consultation practitioner. She's worked in the public and private sector, most recently with WSP in Kelowna, and as the provincial manager for planning, landscape, architecture, and urban design. She has overseen various official plans, engagement strategies, strategic plans, and urban design guidelines, from urban forestry to Main Street improvements. Nola has worked extensively on urban infill in Western Canada and large-scale development projects throughout the BC interior. Before moving back to BC in 2020, Nola worked in the Edmonton region for a decade and taught planning at the University of Alberta. Nola recently served as a juror on the City of Kelowna's Infill 2.0 competition and served as host and chair of the Planning Institute of BC's 2023 conference in Sun Peaks, and recently emceed World Town Planning Day in Vancouver. So let's welcome Nola. Thank you.
Okay, great. I'm sorry. Down here. Thank you. I'm at the tail end of a cough, So if I start having a coughing fit, please feel to ask questions while that's happening. Yes, that's me. Thank you. Good. Thank you. I'm going to get a 2-minute warning before this is over, but if anybody wants to give me a 5-minute warning in, another 5-minute warning in, I basically mashed 3 different presentations together. I have 50 slides in 15 minutes, so this is going to be quick. So let's see how we do. So what I'm going to go through first is how we have approached this whole implementation. You know, I manage a team of 22 people in development planning. We also have a policy planning team. So I recognize compared to a lot of the other municipalities in the area, we've got a great deal of horsepower. So we're in a pretty luxury position compared to some of the other municipalities around us. So we have been very fortunate to be able to take these bylaw amendments and OCP amendments to council early. Got some of my colleagues in the back there. I've got a good fortune of working with a sizable experienced team. So this all was absolutely a team effort and really happy to work with them. So as I said, I'm not going to speak to each slide and how they specifically relate to Kelowna's situation and our bylaw, as I don't know if that's particularly useful to your work. My intent is to zip through these slides. Most of these have been presented to council already, or will be presented to other groups. We've got like a engagement session with UDI and CHBA tomorrow, for example. You know, but what I want to explain is kind of the thought process and how we approached all of this. So I've been working in Kelowna on projects in the region for 3+ years, but I just joined the city in December, so it's right when all of this legislation started rolling out. So when I joined, we were having discussions about what's our general direction regarding small-scale multi-unit housing. How many units is too many? Where should they go? What about parking? What about infrastructure? All the same questions everyone in this room is dealing with and you know, questioning and wondering about. Members of the team are preparing to take forward our short-term rental bylaw changes in January, and we made some assumptions or had some information that's proven to be incorrect. And I know, is anybody here from Penticton? Penticton kind of had that same thing happen last week. There were exemptions they were hoping for and didn't get, so it's been fun, right? So, so what we really needed to have was an overall approach we could easily explain to our own staff. We've got a large team. We had to figure out how do we communicate effectively to our own team what it is we're doing and what we're going to do before it's all approved so we can advise applicants and not really interrupt that approval stream of housing. How can we explain this to our council? How can we effectively communicate this to our community? So we decided to implement the legislation as well as we could, except that there would be mistakes. And we wouldn't overshoot the efforts, you know, until we were able to get those basic fundamentals right. We knew it wouldn't be perfect, but our job would be to provide solid reasoning to our council and community in terms of how we approached implementation of these new rules. So just getting into the background, I think this is all probably familiar to all of you. There was the small-scale multi-unit housing, there was the transit-oriented areas, and then there's the additional implementation pieces that were to come, including OCP amendments, engineering, design guidelines, and procedures bylaws. So I worked in consulting for 10 years. Every time we started a new project, I would start by making a very simple table. A version of this table floated around. We put it on our website explaining our 2024 planning legislation changes. Things haven't been perfect. Somebody in local media actually told us that calling the webpage 2024 planning legislation changes was really boring and unimaginative, so that was nice of them to say. But you know, basically when we looked at how do we parcel up the city, how do we apply different rules, we can't apply the same rules everywhere, obviously. So we just started looking at what we were dealing with, and as it came through in a table, it really didn't seem as overwhelming as it initially seemed, right? And so we just kept kind of chipping away as we'd go to figure out what we were doing and how we were going to do it. And of course, yeah, there were hiccups as we went, but it was all manageable. So we didn't go to council once, we didn't go to council twice, we didn't go 3 times, we went 4 times. We went to council 4 times. We went in January to introduce that we were going to be talking about this to council. And then we actually split our package up into 2 to talk about suburban and agricultural areas. And then we came back again on February 12th to talk about our core area and our transit-oriented areas. In the midst of all that, there were some media interviews and discussion. And then we came back to council again on March 11th. And then I think we had the fastest turnaround in history of adoption happening and then getting approval by Ministry of Transportation. So we actually had our package adopted on March 18th, which none of us saw happening. So when that happened, we had a bunch of files in stream for council and then had to amend all of them because the zones that we were changing no longer existed. So look out for that when that happens to you. But basically, we've got our core area boundary that's outlined in the red. We've got our permanent growth area in the suburban areas. So that was kind of how we decided to make that switch. And we felt like we needed to have distinction between these zones. I'm just gonna keep rolling through here. That's our heritage area. I'll talk a little bit more about that. But in our suburban areas, we didn't want to be requiring, DPs for fewer than 3 units. So forming character DPs are required for 3 and 4 dwelling units. Because we're a snow community, we applied that exemption to still require 1 parking stall per unit. And so that was our justification. We had this debate internally. Do we push it or do we not? And we're not Victoria, we're not Vancouver, we don't have the transit service. It would be kind of an unfair move to be towing people during snowstorm events and not provide for on-site parking. So those were some of the discussions we had as a team. We had to think through things we usually take at zoning, such as riparian areas, and come up with rules around those, determining what that land take would be. We had regulations and rules around our agricultural lots and how we were going to treat those in consideration of, some of those properties not being serviced, but being large enough to accommodate ample parking on site. Some of the definition, you guys don't care about definition updates, right? I'm going to skip. Okay, so, but the mantra, for the team was perfect is the enemy of good. We just have to work at it and keep moving through it, work the problem, and figure out where there's gaps and what we need to fix as we go. So that was our first February 12th meeting. Our council was not entirely thrilled at this whole thing. Right. Oops, right. It was a little touch and go for a bit, right? And there was a lot of feeling that, this was all being pushed on councils, and I think that was the case across the region. We weren't special in that at all. So we came back on February 12th. We recapped what we were doing. We explained that, the second round, we were going to be talking about our core areas, because that seemed a bit more palatable. So we chose to go forward with our suburban areas first, thinking that would be the more contentious piece, and then come forward with the core neighborhoods, because the city of Kelowna has been sort of advancing infill housing and options for close to 20 years in the core of the city. So a bit more familiar, not so out of the blue to a lot of the residents. And those discussions have been happening in some shape or form for the last 5+ years as the OCP was redone and the zoning bylaw was rewritten as well. So there was a, better than average level of understanding around some of that. So we were then reviewing our small-scale multi-unit and our transit-oriented development areas. And one of the big challenges we had was, okay, so we can allow 6 units in the core area. Should we? Are we not allowed to? And at what point, how can we effectively communicate that this is actually a very unlikely scenario? Because most lots won't permit 6 units due to parking, due to landscaping requirements, due to waste collection. So we actually just were able to pull those numbers so we could get a sense of it. So in our urban areas, we were at about 11,000 lots that would be impacted. Suburban areas were 14,000. In our core neighborhoods, it was going to be about 2,000 lots that were large enough to actually accommodate 6 units. But that's not even factoring in boulevard trees and accesses on active transportation corridors, transit corridors, et cetera. So there's so many factors. But, you know, the line was, this isn't going to be a deluge of infill. It's really going to be more of a gentle rain between interest rates, material costs, labor costs. We're not looking at this massive rollout of units. It's really going to be a kind of steady incremental increase. The City of Kelowna, and before I worked at the City of Kelowna, I was a judge on our Infill 2.0 challenge, and we were working on a design competition on lots in neighborhoods that don't have lane access. The first infill competition resulted in the rezoning of 800 lots, and over 7 years, 20% of those lots were redeveloped with up to fourplexes. So those are the best conditions. Those are the best conditions. So there's a 20% uptake in that. The interest rates were record low. There was labor availability. You know, the market was super hot at that time. So those were the best conditions, and it was a 20% change. So that gave us a really good frame of reference for what's to come. So again, back to tables. This is what we were looking at. It doesn't look quite so scary. So we noted at the bottom, and this was on our website as well, due to site restrictions, including lot dimensions, parking requirements, garbage and recycling, and landscaping, the maximum achievable density will often still be 4 dwelling units, even in the core of the city. Okay, thank you. All right, so let's see. So we identified municipalities to eliminate parking requirements due to us being a snow community. Height, we applied some rules to ensure some sensitive integration with some of the neighboring lots. And we had to look at our waste and recycling as well to determine how we were going to operate that. When most developers are looking at infill lots, they're going to look at their parking, their waste collection, their access, and then go from there if they're going to purchase and redevelop a site. So on some of our transit supportive corridors, we have some challenges, in all honesty. It's a real chicken and egg timing issue. We want to be able to support transit, we want bike lanes, but we have to be very cautious and measured in how much road right-of-way we are taking from infill sites to ensure that they are still developable at the scale and density we want. If we take too much, we're going to be, nobody likes the word sterilizing, but we'll be sterilizing those lots. So we don't want to do that. We want to encourage infill in these areas. We did a review of our landscape section. Fortunately, we had a pretty good idea of what we had to do based on our zoning bylaw amendments. So that was looking at growing medium volumes and in cases where we had above ground power lines and things of that nature. And different rules for different parts of the city. Oh, I won't go into this. I got 3 minutes. So, so then there's our transit-oriented areas. I'll skip to the interesting one, which is the hospital exchange. So, because there's a helipad there. So we had to contact the person who nobody knew who to call. His name's Ron Sherman, if you're interested. Does anybody know Ron Sherman? Okay, he's the national consultant for all of the different air ambulances in Canada, so you've got to know. But we had to check with him on what our building heights and what our sort of takeoff areas would be and how we should treat this area. This area also intersects with part of our heritage neighborhood, so we had a lot of discussions on this piece. So this, in the yellow, is our heritage area. And I don't know if you guys want to hear the details. We can talk about this in the question period. But we've got designated area, and then we've got heritage properties on the register. And one is done by, designated is by bylaw. Register means you can still make renovations or alterations. So that little dark gray area is the area that's part of the TOA. And there was quite a bit of outrage about this being designated as a TOA on account of it being 2 bus stops in front of the hospital. But our actual TOA, that's Queensway outside of City Hall, was not designated. So, but the province indicated that was based on employment numbers, which doesn't sound too surprising when you put it that way, does it? So we had to amend our height maps as well, working through that. And we had discussions about whether or not we should even have heights in our OCP any longer. So that's a to be continued discussion. Something that we're working on now is our development application and heritage procedures bylaw. So we're making amendments to these packages. We're actually taking, if anybody wants to listen, we'll be going back to council on April 8th with another package to do with our procedures bylaw that has to do with different delegated authority levels for different things, like including signage, for example. And we'll be modifying some of our fees because we've created new zones that we don't have fees for. And that was a real tricky one, actually, for everyone to manage, just the navigation of the fine timing of every piece of this. So that was the interesting part. So we worked very closely with our clerks team to manage this. What else do we have? We took the opportunity to update some of our bylaw terms and definitions and update a few other things. So again, a lot of horsepower on our team, so thanks to all of them for all their great work. We're looking at amending some of our fees. We are working on amending some of our engineering fees as well. And I won't make you read that table, but something else we've decided to update is how we administer and our bylaw for our public engagement requirements. So policy 367, that'll be presented to council as well on April 8th. Now that we're really only looking at OCP amendments and DVPs, we really need to make a kind of more fulsome effort at how we deal with OCP amendments to give the public the opportunity and give council an opportunity and give the development community an opportunity to just do a better job of that, not treat it as a checkbox, but like a genuine engagement effort. So we're adjusting some of our timing on when we have signs posted and when we do mail outs and things like that. So let's see, what's next? We're gonna modernize our sign bylaw. A lot of businesses are struggling, so we're looking to do some updates there. Because last time our bylaw was updated, it wasn't that long ago, but pre-COVID. We've got to do a review of our vehicle and bike parking in light of all of these these provincial changes, how we treat our car share, language and definitions, as well as a cash and lieu parking program. And we've got to coordinate this all because we were very fortunate to receive half funding, so we've got to look at our transit supportive corridors. And engineering's got a streetscape urbanization program as well that's going ahead. So I guess my closing advice is my dad fully took credit for this quote, and I finally looked it up this morning, and it's Martin Luther King Jr., so I can't believe he took credit for this quote. I'm gonna confront him about it on the weekend. I was pretty appalled. but he's very Irish. It was very difficult. But yeah, overall, what we've tried to do is, just take a step, do the work, and work through it as we go. And we're still doing that. We don't have everything worked out yet, even though we've gotten over this first leg of adoption. But we're happy to help and chat with anybody who needs a pep talk, because I know it's a lot of work. So thanks very much, and I'll talk to y'all soon. Thanks.
Thank you. Yes, not bad. Just maybe a minute and a half over. It's all good. Okay, well, thank you so much, Nola. That was a really helpful overview. And next up, we have Brad Dollevoet from the District of Summerland. And he will be presenting with Randy Houle from the town of Oliver. So I'll just read your bios before you come up. Brad is a registered professional planner and a seasoned management executive with over 14 years of municipal management experience. Brad is currently the Director of Development Services with the District of Summerland and has had previous planning director positions in Okanagan and Alberta. Brad is passionate about rural development and community building for small Western Canadian communities. And Randy is a registered professional planner with a master's degree from the University of Waterloo. Randy has been employed by the town of Oliver for the past 5 years as a director of development services, and prior to that, as a planner with the city of Penticton. Randy acts as the sole planner for the town and is appointed as the subdivision approving officer. So thank you. Welcome, Randy and Brad.
Sure. There you go. Hello, welcome everyone. It's good to see a good group of people in the room here today while this can set up. It's not like we have a lot of work on our plate right now, do we? Spend 3 hours together in a room chatting about implementation, but do appreciate it. I do want to also thank, as a few people in the crowd I've got active applications with right now. Sorry, this is the reason why your applications have been moving forward. It's because of all this work that we've been doing to our zoning bylaw. And so Randy and I have agreed to kind of tag team this one. So I'll be starting off and then kind of going from a different lens from the city of Kelowna, looking at a small community's perspective. We do not have a bench staff of 22 planning staff under our belt to try to get this done. So we're managing lots of different priorities of council as well as our community, and then on top of that, legislation happening, which has basically changed everything with regards to our zoning bylaw. So what's happening for Summerland as well as within our region, that's what we're here to talk about today. There we go. So in the South Okanagan, we're pretty fortunate. We've already had a regional technical advisory committee set up under our regional growth strategy. And we were able to meet, pretty early in November, I think was our first meeting, when we saw the changes happening with legislation. And we kind of recognized, we were actually meeting on other topics, but we started talking about legislation coming because it was all dumped on our laps. The importance of meeting more regularly to talk about consistency happening within our different jurisdictions. So we've met a few times since that time. We were also emailing regularly amongst our planning staff and we do think there's value in at least understanding what other jurisdictions are doing, and I think that's a broader sense what's happening today, understanding what we're doing as well, and being able to learn from you guys in the room. But knowing where we think our different communities could go to, so that not necessarily being completely consistent, but understanding that you may be learning something from another community, which is definitely what happened through our discussions. Is like, oh, hey, Penticton's doing this. That's a good idea. Let's include that in our amendment bylaw as well. So it's been really positive, and I want to thank Randy and anyone else that's watching from South Oak and being part of those calls. So Summerland specifically, we're a bit more fortunate than other jurisdictions in that we have a urban containment boundary set up. A lot of other local governments in BC don't have this in place, and now legislation is basically saying this is where that density has to occur, is within this urban containment boundary. And Summerland is a large geographic municipality, a lot of agricultural land within the ALR, a lot of hillside areas where we don't want to see development occur. So this urban growth boundary that we've had within our official community plan has been in place since 2013. It's allowed to us to then really specify where we want to see this density occurring, including Bill 44. And luckily enough, the province is enshrined in the legislation. So this is the areas that will be impacted primarily within Summerland. So our approach, we've got 6 single-family and duplex zones, residentials. Don't ask me why I have so many zones currently in our zoning bylaw. There's a whole bunch. It was a holdover, and I'm sure a lot of our zones are in need of review, and this is a good opportunity to do that. So we're consolidating 6 zones into 3 new residential urban zones, so kind of taking the Kelowna's lead here of the RU acronym. And specifically, when we saw this image, everyone's seen this image here on the right-hand side from the provincial policy manual. When we looked at it in Summerland as this is the province's intent, how do we ensure that our bylaw doesn't stand in the way of this type of format of development of up to 2 to 4 residential units happening within our existing low-density residential areas? We considered that by creating a new use definition called multi-unit housing, which means a building containing up to and including 4 dwelling units divided either horizontally or vertically by a common property wall, et cetera, et cetera. So really, we don't really care whether you call that a triplex, a fourplex, 2 duplexes. we're saying is all multi-unit housing. The intent is to be flexible because we still have yet to receive these standardized designs that are supposed to be coming down the pipe from the province. We don't really know what that's going to look like. So that multi-unit housing definition is intended to be flexible so that whatever is coming from the province or as well coming from the development community, we'll be able to enshrine it within our zoning bylaw. We're also proposing increases in height, density, reduced setbacks, increasing suite size because we're adding duplexes now to all our single-family residential zones. Really, what's the difference between a house and a secondary suite and a duplex? Not much. And then parking review, finally. So just want to do a brief overview of the 3 zones, and I'm going to pass it over to Randy here to talk about Oliver. So a residential urban infill zone is our new kind of more densified RU single-family residential zone that we're proposing within primarily our core, surrounding our core areas of downtown Summerland and also our lower town area, which is basically the area near the waterfront. Uses, single detached housing, multi-unit housing, duplex housing are permitted uses. What is something unique to this zone is the reduced parcel width and size. So if there is lane access, we're recommending it to be a shrunk down lot to 7.5 meters, and then also 260 square meters in parcel size. The intention of that is to actually provide some flexibility to the developer as well on the subdivision side. See, this image on the bottom right-hand side is a good example, and these images that I'm showing in my PowerPoint are all from projects in Summerland right now. So this was an existing development. It was a CD zone. It's across from our middle school. Those are single-family dwellings with secondary suites in the basement. Quite dense, even though it doesn't look that dense. There's 22 units in there along a block, a residential block. So, you know, that was intentional as well, is that you know, not every developer is going to want to stick 4 units on one lot. You know, there's different formats of tenure, et cetera, that they're going to want to encourage for sale. So we think this would be attractive in different core areas surrounding the downtown core. So that's why we went to this urban infill zone. 3 stories in height, which is going to be the big topic of the discussion, I think, with the community. 3-meter front yards and 1.2 meter side yards. The residential urban zone is kind of our replacement for our standard single-family residential zone. This is maintaining our RSD1. RSD1 was our standard single-family zone before, 460 square meters and 12-meter widths. Again, the big topic of discussion here with the community will be 3 stories in height. Again, these images are 2 projects. One, one's a duplex with suites. The other one is 2 front-back duplexes. They're already happening in our community. They went through a rezoning process. They got approved. I don't want to say it's not scary to see this development happening within our single-family residential areas. It was already happening. It was just going through a rezoning process. So this is the messaging we need to kind of provide as planners to the community. Again, 3-meter front yards and 1.5 meter setbacks for this one. The RU3 zone is kind of our more suburban oriented type development zone. We have some outlying areas of our community. Trout Creek is a great example for those that know Summerland. Far distance away from our downtown core along the waterfront. Larger parcel sizes in that area already. And it's kind of got a single family character in that area. Because of their larger parcel sizes in the area, that allows us to spread that density of 4 units. So we're not encouraging the multi-unit housing in this zone, keeping it at 2 stories, and allowing carriage houses, which is our accessory dwelling unit definition, secondary suites, and that type of development to fill up to the 3 or 4 residential units. One thing unique about this zone as well is we're making it flexible so that it can be applied either within our urban growth boundary or out of our urban growth boundary, because we have some areas that have existing servicing within our community that are outside of where we want growth to occur. So we've prescribed within the proposed zone up to 3 dwelling units outside the urban containment boundary, and 4 dwelling units in conformance with Bill 44. And last slide here, and I'll pass it to Randy. Other changes, we've got maximum height of carriage houses of 7.5 meters. Instead of a 1-story, we're going up to 2 stories for carriage houses. Again, that's our ADU definition. We're allowing secondary suites and duplex and townhouse units. Mentioned no maximum size for secondary suites already. Allowing, again, because of Bill 44, secondary suites and carriage houses on the same lot to get up to the 3 or 4 residential units. And mention the parking review. We are recommending, although it's still going to be a topic of discussion with the community, I just presented to council last week, and they've got some feedback from me on this as well, but multi-unit duplex townhousing and apartments going to 1 space per unit. And then, but maintaining, if you're going to knock a tiny house and put another big house on, you're going to give us 2 parking stalls on site to do that. So maintaining 2 parking spaces for single detached housing. I'll pass it on to Randy.
5 minutes?
Sorry.
Thank you. So in Oliver, we took approach to combine all our single-family zones into 1 zone. So we had 4 zones, and we just took them all and put them into 1 zone. We still have the mobile home park zone as well in single-family. We took an approach to allow up to 4 units per parcel in any configuration. So that could be 4 small houses. It could be 2 duplexes. It could be 2 single-family homes with secondary suites in each, but really just allowing the flexibility of 4 units of any kind and any size, really, as long as you meet the maximum height and lot coverage and parking requirements. We made changes to allow secondary suites and duplexes, which I know was a change in the building code several years ago. So we made that change, reducing parking spaces to 1.5 spaces per unit for apartments. Single-family properties and duplexes will still have 2 parking spaces, but for townhouses, I was able to work with council to get it down to 1.5, which I see as a win for Oliver. And then removing visitor parking spaces for small-scale multi-unit housing. So there is still some merit to having visitor parking for larger apartment buildings, but just for those 4-unit projects to just have no visitor parking space, I think is a good move. One thing too in Oliver, we didn't have any of the transit-orientated areas or any of those more complicated legislation, so it was a bit easier. And Oliver's a fairly small community with not a ton of development pressure, so it was easier to make the decision to combine everything to 1 zone. And the approach that I took with our council was really to let the market dictate what Oliver needs. I went back and forth a lot on parcel size and should we split it up and have certain, like almost what Summerland did with certain parcel sizes in certain neighborhoods, but really in Oliver, if you go and create a bunch of tiny lots in a neighborhood, well, in Oliver, I mean, you're not gonna have a yard and those properties likely won't sell, so developers aren't gonna do that. So really it was just let the market dictate what Oliver needs. This is a photo showing the urban containment boundary in Oliver, and you'll see the yellow outline is the municipal boundary and the blue is the urban containment area. So it does cover most of town. Where it's bordered by is the agricultural areas. This is a comparison to the provincial manual for the recommended provisions. So you'll see in there that we've met most of the provisions except the front and rear setbacks. So what I had recommended to council is to keep a 6-meter setback for a 3-story building, but if it's a 2-story building, then they could have the 3-meter setback. And currently carriage houses are allowed to have a 3-meter setback, and they're often 2 stories, so that was to make sure that those buildings don't become non-conforming. Also, as part of this process, we did some OCP-related amendments. One of them was removing unit per hectare maximums in the medium and high-density zones. So if we didn't do that, then there'll actually be some properties in these single-family areas that are allowed to have 4 units. There'll be some properties that won't even be allowed to have that many in the medium and high-density zones unless we make this change to get rid of the density maximum in the medium and high-density zones. So we felt that was an important change to make. And then also, knowing that we have to do another OCP amendment in the next few years, the move right now was just to basically just blanket the whole town in DP areas and then exempt single-family dwellings and secondary suites. So right now we require development permits for duplexes or higher. Duplexes are delegated, But as I mentioned before, Oliver doesn't have the major development pressures, so council likes to see most of the applications, so they'll continue to see that. And I just want to talk lastly about an implementation plan for Bill 44. So these were the steps that I had identified that we'll be going through for the next couple years. So from the top, the zoning amendments I'm working through. Development procedure bylaw was one that I had identified so that there are language in that bylaw to how you provide notice prior to first reading when you can't hold a public hearing. So we needed to speak to that procedure. Council's procedure bylaw amendment, that one's more on the legislative side, but that one speaks to someone not being able to appear as a delegate in cases where there is no public hearing being held, just so you don't have a de facto public hearing when you're not allowed to hold a public hearing. Interim housing needs assessment, that one's underway. Infrastructure capacity review is something we're looking at if any of our neighborhoods can't support that density, and when we need to build a new well, when we need to expand the wastewater treatment plant, so that's underway. And then obviously the larger OCP and zoning amendments, and then we'll look at the development cost charge bylaw, amenity cost charge bylaw, and subdivision bylaws in 2025. And that's it, thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Brad and Randy. And next up, we have Allison Aspivit. She's with Lidstone Company. Allison is a municipal lawyer licensed in Alberta and British Columbia. She advises and advocates for clients on a wide range of municipal law issues, including land use planning, development, real estate, expropriation, governance, and enforcement. She has appeared as an advocate before many different bodies in Alberta. In addition to private practice, Allison has worked in-house for municipalities and businesses. In her practice, she aims to provide practical solutions to immediate problems and to identify opportunities to develop best practices. Welcome, Allison.
Excellent. I feel a little bad because the two presentations that have come up have been engaging and very practical. My presentation is probably going to be a lot of overview or repeats of previous presentations that you've attended. But what I'm hoping is that as questions come up, you'll see that legal review tends to ask, can we do this? And the presentations you guys have listened to really answer the question, how do we or should we do this? And so my focus tends to be a lot narrower. And in fact, in 15 minutes, I really only focus on the legal implications of these new rules. And without any guidance from case law precedent, I'm reading the same pieces of legislation and amendments and policy manuals that you guys have. I don't know that I have any brilliant takeaways. The questions that have come in through our office tend to be focused on two separate issues. And the first is, how do you incorporate the rules? So planning for the zoning. And the second is, how do you pay for the services that are required to support that zoning? And then lots of little sub-issues within those two much bigger issues. So for the most part, I thought I would just sort of run through some of the questions that have come through our office, try and answer those for you, see if that's useful. And then I'm hoping in the questions and answers, there may be some new and additional stuff that we will talk about. This was a busy legislative session. It's the fourth session of the 42nd Parliament. A total of 48 bills were introduced and 47 enacted. These are the pieces of legislation that everyone in this room and listening online is eventually going to have to bring into their own internal rules. The Short-Term Rental Accommodations Act is quite interesting. I've been working with clients quite extensively on their own zoning rules in relation to those particular issues, and so it's nice to see that come from the province to have some additional enforcement power and expectations around that. Almost everyone today is going to be talking about Bill 44. But one of the questions that's asked is how do we pay for things? And I think Bill 46 is going to be a lot of the answers to the questions about how you are funding some of the work or some of the services that are associated with this infill development. And then, of course, Nola spoke really eloquently about some of the transit-oriented work that's going on in Kelowna. In terms of the highlights, the things that are in force right now is the restriction on public hearings. So if a proposal is consistent with the official community plan as of November 30th, there doesn't need to be any public hearings. And so we get quite a few questions about what's considered to be an in-stream application, and the legislation was quite clear. You are only exempt from this particular application of the new rules if your community had given first reading to the proposed amendment on November 30th, 2023. So there probably are already applications that are moving forward in a number of communities where maybe cooperatively they have continued on with public hearing processes, but technically, if that is consistent with the OCP, that would be not just an election to not hold a public hearing, it would actually be a requirement not to hold a public hearing. There's also the amenity cost contributions. I've had a couple of emails that have come in about the content of an amenity contribution bylaw, but I don't know anyone who's actually adopted or implemented it. So if you guys are sort of doing some of the financial pieces first, it'd be interesting to know what you've done and how you've defined things, because I think the project plans that I've seen from some of the previous presenters is what a lot of people are doing, which is that they're meeting the SMA zoning regulations, and then they're going to figure out how to finance it as a later stage in the rollout of this particular set of legislative amendments. Everyone's working towards the June 30th, 2024 deadline. Some of the ones, I was actually really pleased to see a bunch of project plans, because I'm often asked for smaller communities who maybe don't have 22 planners to sort of help them come up with these project plans. And so having those deadlines in mind, if you are dealing with limited resources, can be helpful to think, okay, does it make sense to try and simplify or deal with some of these things that are future deadlines all in one go? But these are the deadlines that everyone is sort of working towards. The housing needs report might be quite interesting. I know for some communities, they've already reached out to some consultants in order to, there's a very short list of things that would need to be incorporated into an amended housing needs report in order to comply with Bill 44. But there are other communities who have very superficial sort of 2 or 3 page ones, and the work that goes into one of those housing needs reports can be quite extensive. And so both budgeting and creating sort of a work plan for how you're going to gather the data that you need and then put that into an actionable item, even though the deadline isn't for a couple of years, you may want to bring it up to inform some of the conversations you're having in relation to the SMA housing. People who attended some of the other planning conferences with members of my firm will probably recognize this chart. It's not mine. It's been incorporated in lots of different presentations. This is basically just a summary of when you don't have to meet the SMA regulations. I'm not going to go through all of them. But one of the things I did want to focus on is sometimes the questions that come into me are, well, for example, we have a steep slope area in our community, and we really think that we have a slam dunk in terms of getting one of these exemptions, which is a particular process. The rules and regulations for how you get that exemption are still being developed in kind of an ad hoc way. We've helped some communities apply for or submit letters to request the exemption. But sometimes when I ask the question of my client, have you thought about just using your existing DPA hazardous area development guidelines? They sort of don't seem to understand that just because we have these new SMA regulations doesn't mean that where there are areas that have been identified in a development permit area as maybe not suitable for high density or certain types of development, that you can't similarly apply those guidelines to the SMA rules and, density that's contemplated by Bill 44. I touched on this a fair bit in one of my earlier presentations. I just quickly want to talk about restrictions on the regulatory powers. You'll find that what the legislation says is that a local government can't create an unreasonable prohibition or restriction. The case law has indicated, this is, I'm sure anyone who's ever talked to a lawyer has heard this case, it's Vavilov. It's the case that was the show The Americans was based on. So it was a gentleman whose parents were spies. He lost his citizenship and then applied and found that the Supreme Court of Canada found that immigration had unreasonably applied immigration rules to him. So it's a fun case if you like Hollywood stuff, but it is also very helpful for anyone in this room who's doing any kind of local government stuff, because it really does set out in a lot of detail what any type of government body needs to do in order to make a defensible decision. And two of the examples that we've come up with, and I think sometimes these are helpful when people are trying to figure out, okay, reasonableness is a spectrum, and where am I falling on that spectrum? An example of something that probably without any controversy would be unreasonable is if you were to rezone large swaths of your community as industrial in order to get around some of these new regulations. You know, you very clearly have residential use in those areas. And then the second example, and I've listened to lots of excellent descriptions of different communities in the region who are using reasonable judgment in order to individualize those rules, make sure that the regulations work for them. Relatively quickly, every once in a while, I get a phone call that asks me, you know, what happens if we don't follow these rules? And the reality of the situation is it's not likely that enforcement is going to happen on, you know, sort of the day after July 1st, which is a holiday. But the minister can enact a zoning bylaw to override the local government's own zoning. And so I think the presentations that have gone before me have shown at the end of the day, it's better to have some input into how it is that you're implementing these rules in your own community, even if that implementation is imperfect. I think you'll find that there are probably some relatively simple tweaks that can be made. I've heard really great descriptions of zones, some probably blanket rules that could be introduced into a zoning bylaw that would allow you to sort of meet the spirit and intention and, you know, give yourself a little bit of extra time so that you can actually more cohesively come up with a plan to deal with what the intention of some of these new rules are. The question that always comes up every single time it gets asked is, how do we pay for this? I come from Alberta. We have a relatively developed off-site levy regime, which is very comparable to DCCs. My answer is always DCCs. I understand that historically DCCs have been maybe developed with a little less reference to how much it costs to build out and pay for infrastructure in a community, and more so what the development community might tolerate in terms of an off-site levy. It might be worthwhile for some of the people in this room to look at what are being charged in other jurisdictions that have done sort of a full economic analysis of what it costs to both build, maintain, and grow with community needs. And I think you'll find, at least my observation has been, that DCCs are often totally untethered to any of that kind of economic analysis in a way that is, in Alberta, just part of, you know, there were several successful court challenges. And so if you're going to do an off-site levy in Alberta, it's been done with a bunch of engineering to back up the specific calculations. And Council knows and tends not to get involved in figuring out how much people would be willing to pay in their community. So what I hope you will take away from everyone's presentation today is that there's so many overlapping rules. There really isn't going to be one thing that is going to make or break any of the work that you're doing in this regard. You're going to have a bunch of tools if you have some genuine planning concerns in your community about safety, about environmental protection, sort of unique heritage features in different communities. One of the things that's come up quite a bit is whether or not municipalities can continue to use covenants and contractual tools, or if these are sort of done away with as a result of the new legislation, and absolutely not. Until there's a court case that says otherwise. The position, I think, of most lawyers is you can continue to contract for something different than what is hoped for or expected from a zoning perspective, and likely there would be some underlying rationale for why it is that you have a property owner who's willing to agree to something like a Section 219 covenant that maybe is prohibiting things like subdivision by way of strata plan or something similar to that. And the other one that's come up is the application of these rules is going to be fascinating. There seems to be, at least on one side of the fence, an expectation that people will just go and build it without any regulatory oversight, and that just isn't the case. In terms of legal support, this is an entirely new regime. People call me all the time, and I say, I'll think about it and I'll get back to you. Sometimes I call around and ask my colleagues if they've had similar questions come in. We do a lot of guessing. We do a lot of analysis of what may or may not happen in the future, but things are changing pretty drastically on a pretty continuous basis. Like, I went to go look at the provincial policy manual for the transit-oriented areas and realized it had been updated sort of in this month. There's still regulations that have been referenced by some of my co-presenters, and so, those regulations could drastically change some of the advice that has gone out, some of the work that people are doing, and that's incredibly frustrating. We've been assisting clients with literally everything under the sun. If there's something that is really of key significance to your council or to your staff, the next slide, which is you can email me. I'm generally not very good at answering emails promptly, but we do have a casual legal services line. I think for most of the municipal clients, through MIABC, you have access to the service. It has to be 30 minutes or less, but we've answered a ton of questions through that program. And so, do take advantage of that. It is helpful to us, and I think it's helpful for the community at large, because we can sort of say, oh, well, we have gotten a bunch of questions about X, Y, or Z, and then give presentations on those subjects. Good.
Okay, now we have time for about 10 minutes of questions, and then we'll have our break. So Jess is gonna help facilitate the questions, and we can come around with a mic, and let us know who you're directing your question to.
Oh, you can hear me now? I've got a mic over there. If you just turn the on button on, that should work. So we got any questions? Brilliant.
Hi, Jesse with Newtown Architecture and Engineering. My question's for Nola. You had mentioned, briefly touched on the fact that your delegated authority might be changing a little bit in the months to come. I'm just wondering if that relates to form and character and kind of expanding staff authority to approve form and character development permits, things like that.
Do you want to answer your question?
But it's still subject to council, I know.
It is still subject to council. I kind of need to be a little bit cautious about what we put out. But there will be some proposed changes to form and character, so we can catch up on that if you like at another time.
Sure, thank you.
Thanks. we're having to be very careful about what we put on our website for information for the public versus what's getting approved or what's getting presented. So just want to tread lightly there. Thank you.
Understandably. Great. Have we got any other questions?
Beerta DeClue with Urban Options Planning. You had a specific question. I've got a specific one too. In Summerland, you used to have FAR in most of your residential zones. Are you continuing with that, or is that something that's gone to the wayside now?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Actually, that's something that I mentioned the learnings we got from other communities, from our regional group that we have. The city of Penticton, when they were looking at developing their new draft single-family replacement zone, they said, well, why do we need FAR anymore? And because we've got density, we've got setbacks, we've got site coverage. Really, what is FAR even doing in these single-family residential zones? And I really thought about that. I'm like, oh, you know what? Good point. And so for our RU1 and RE2 zone, we are also recommending removal of FAR within those two zones, following the city of Penticton's lead on that.
Thank you. I think we've got time for 2 more questions before the health break.
Mehdi with Emil Anderson. I've got a question for Nola. I realize that MF1 zoning, which would support a sixplex up to 6 units, is only limited to core or urban core areas. How about if developers have access to lands which could accommodate as far as a land area in outside, where it's maximum to 4 units, would your staff would recommend subdivision to attain more units for those larger lots, or just applying for rezoning to MF1 within those RU1 zones?
Tyler, actually sitting behind you, had some of these files. But in some of those cases, we've been looking at using the MF2 zone instead. It'll depend on the context and what's adjacent, but we've had a few situations where, it just makes more sense for, say, a lot consolidation of two properties in an otherwise RU1 zone, and looking at, allowing 8 townhomes, for example, but all kind of context specific. Mm-hmm. So if you've got something in mind,
Thank you.
Let us know. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much. And we got time for 1 more question. Who's your question for? For Nola, who's your question for? Okay, let's go for the broad panel.
Thank you. Jeanette Elmore, Modus Planning and Engagement. I have a broad question that might be specific. I'm wondering how the panel is treating CD zones, if they can be considered restricted zones, either broadly or by sub-area or by lot.
It's a good question. Thinking off the top of my, honestly, I think we haven't really got to that point yet of our implementation process, at least in Summerland's case. Maybe Nola's ahead here, but really looking at those CD zones. We only have a few of them within Summerland that would be applicable. Some of them are commercial zones, but there are a few that might have to change. You're right, because of the restriction, it being a restricted zone. Nicely, kind of conveniently for us, I think 2 or 3 of them we can consolidate into our new residential zones. So we can rezone them at the same time into RU1 or RE2 or RE3. And that will probably be our recommended approach.
Thank you. I can consult with my table back there of colleagues, but so correct me if I'm wrong, but we haven't been encouraging a lot of CD zones over the last few years, and the majority of ones that are active or maybe approved but not yet quite developed far exceed any of the small scale multi-unit regulations. So did I get it right? Okay, thank you. Thanks for coming.
In Oliver, there was only 1 CD zone, and they already allow a range of single-family duplexes and townhomes, so sort of irrelevant there. Thanks.
I've actually seen the question come in a few different times, and almost every single time we've looked at the CD zone, the residential uses that are allowed are clustered in different areas, but the definition of restricted zone doesn't apply to the CD zone as a whole. It's just one of the policy choices that was made by the government in their drafting, and so there are lots of zones that don't meet the definition of restricted zone that you may want to encourage additional units in, but you're not required to under the legislation. It would be totally voluntary.
Great, thank you so much. So can we just give another round of applause to Nola, Brad, Randy, and Alison for your presentations and for the Q&A. So we now have a health break. You'll have 15 minutes, so we'll be meeting back here at 3:01. And help yourself to tea, coffee. Outside there should be some snacks as well, and the restrooms are just out on the right. Thank you so much.